Images operate like microorganisms in our minds and bodies. They are like sub-individual and quasi-autonomous beings, which occupy an intermediary position between us and the world, containing to a certain extent the power of will, appetite, and movement. Images appear almost like secondary organisms within the thinking being, parasites or adjuvants. They are like secondary monads that at some moments inhabit the subject and leave it at others. As such, images are endowed with an intense capacity of propagation. The various kinds of groupings they can consolidate form the germ of our adaptation to the prevailing social reality in the object world. They are the force that binds individual bodies and persons with reality and collective ways of doing, making sense, and feeling. Images animate us as embodied observers and serve as part of larger socio-technological networks that compose the world of appearances. Visual economy. If images are quasi-corporeal and even parasitical passengers that travel across time and space in their human mediators, where can we locate them conceptually? Belting compellingly suggests that we can overcome the false dichotomy between internal, endogenous, and external, exogenous, images that threatens to reduce them to either mere phantoms or mere techniques by treating the triad image, medium, body as an indivisible whole. Thus, by definition immaterial, images need a material host, a medium in which they can become embodied. Although technical media can help carry out this function, it is in our bodies that images are born, received, and transported. Thus, too, Belting tells us, a constant interchange takes place between the internal and the external. When the external pictures are re-embodied as our own images, we substitute for their fabricated medium our own body, which, when it serves in this capacity, turns into a living or natural medium. One way to conceptualize these continuous propagations and exchanges between images, bodies, and technological platforms is to model them as visual economies in the classic sense of economy, as the management of lived realities. Although economy today refers most of all to the production and exchange of goods for profit, the management of resources and labor, and even to finance capitalism more generally, its older use is to be the concept of management and administration of temporal realities, whether they be spiritual, intellectual, or material. It is in terms of this earlier role, economy, oikonomia, as living linkages, as sets of relations between the visible and the invisible, that the question of the image has occupied Western thought since the birth of Christianity. The visible domain of pictures and screens evokes the invisible realm of visualizations, beliefs, and affective engagements. And it is at the intersection of these two, the visual economy, that power becomes established and that political rule over territories and the minds and bodies of people is implemented. Focusing on the Byzantine Empire, Monzane argues that the attempt to rule over the whole earth by organizing an empire that derived its power and authority by linking together the visual and the imaginal was Christianity's true genius. Through the production and circulation of images, in the form of portable icons, for example, temporal realities could be unified with celestial truths, and the divine empire could maintain and expand its power without any apparent limits or boundaries. It was thus, she writes, that the process of globalizing the image across the whole world began. Here the relevance of the concept of visual economy to the imaginal empires of our own media-saturated times appears by way of analogy, even though today the government of life follows the dynamic logic of capital rather than divine truths. Like a Byzantine world, ours is a world where power is instituted and claims wide-ranging authority through the production and circulation of images. It's managed within specific visual economies where pictures and screens feed the imaginations that both bind us to the object world and forge social relations. Today, many, if not all, of these images take the form of computer-generated animations, which arguably imply a perceptual reality different from that implied by their cinematic and photographic predecessors. Furthermore, they are images that appear to be in several aspects distinguished by their action-orientated nature. Images we interact with, play with, operate with, images that, like toys or instruments, require gestural manipulation and cognitive engagement based on anticipation and immersion rather than contemplation. Despite the apparent novelty of these computer-generated images, there is nonetheless a lesson to be learned about them from the early critics of cinema who yearned to make sense of socio-political implications of the then new medium. Siegfried Kekuer, for instance, noted an intimate link between the visual culture of his times and the organization of social reality and capitalism. Writing in the 1920s, Kekuer saw the spectacle of uniformly dancing girls in newsreels shown across the globe as reproducing a model of subjectivity based on the logic of Fordist production modes. The medium of film gave expression to the capitalist society's will, merging the dancing legs of newsreel girls with the hand gestures of factory workers into a common social body. As he observed of the cinema, the audience encounters itself. Its own reality is revealed in the fragmented sequence of splendid sense impressions. Likewise, Walter Benjamin, addressing modernity's massive technologies of speed, industrial production, and popular entertainment, argued that the most important function of film was to train human beings in the apperceptions and reactions needed to deal with a vast apparatus, whose role in their lives is expanding almost daily. With varying political consequences, film came to establish equilibrium between our senses and the imperatives of industrial capitalism. If the visual economy of cinema in the early 20th century corresponded with modes of Fordist production and sensibility, one could say that post-cinematic images correspond with post-Fordist production, neoliberal ideologies, and contemporary biopolitical ways of taking charge of the life of individuals and populations. What these newer images describe is a reality where information and immaterial goods are at the center of production and consumption, where the imperative of investment cost-profit circumscribes not only the realm of the economy proper, but also the domains of the individual and the social, where subjects defined in terms of their biological, evolutionary, and emergent properties have entered the realms of both government and the production of wealth, and where wars are waged not to defend the state from external threats, but to relentlessly expand free markets and the neoliberal way of life across the globe. A major social and political concern here is the waning of democracy in the face of contemporary amalgamations of military power, corporate power, and the state. This military-corporate-state complex is underpinned by networks of images that work towards reproducing and sustaining, albeit most often indirectly, the reigning affiliations of power. The codes and strategies by which the world today is made visible are embedded within processes by which bodies and persons become captured in the sensory fabrics of the global neoliberal order that has dominated our lived realities for more than 30 years. Thus, to take one example, video games, such as Grand Theft Auto 4, make us experience North American urban life from an Eastern European immigrant's perspective, letting us feel within our skin and play out what it means to live as an underclass in a present-day metropolis, where individual entrepreneurial freedom thrives at the expense of law and order, and where contesting criminal forces wage a constant war against one another in raw, capitalist state of nature. Here we should note that the video game industry itself is modeled on contemporary post-Fordist production, which exploits the affective and cognitive capacities of its precarious workforce, whose members have ceased to differentiate between work and leisure and been stripped of traditional labor rights. If we consider the screen to be quite simply a surface for animation, we can then consider the image to be the critical operator that, to quote Banksia, presents a relationship between the sayable and the visible. Images partition what is visible from what is not, what can be said from what cannot, and they tell us where and when. In doing so, they establish shared ways of sensing, feeling, and making sense. they weave the common fabric of sensibility that defines the social body with all its inclusions and exclusions. Underscoring, above all, how images administer, partition, and manage the distributions of the sensible, our affects and emotions, our desires and thoughts, our deeds and imaginations, visual economies are characterized by interconnections and reciprocal contexts as well as by cuts, jumps, and interceptions. Still pictures from paintings, drawings, and photographs, and sometimes even moving pictures from films, allow us to reflect from a distance and to visually grasp the whole. The flash flood of video game images makes only partial recognition possible, based as it is on mostly the brain's production of anticipatory images in reaction to constantly shifting screen events. Deleuze and Guattari differentiated three major apparatuses of capture historically deployed in the accumulation of capital and the production of surplus: rent from land, profit from labor, and interest or tax from money. Capture is essentially a process of bringing together bodies and persons into specific arrangements or assemblages to capitalize on their productivity. Accumulation of capital thus implies the exploitation of living beings in circuits of production and consumption that impose on them a system of self-evident facts with standardized desires, ways of doing, and making sense. The close and even organic relation of screen media to capitalism's processes of capture becomes evident in the genealogy. Essential to the rise of entertainment industry were, first of all, the transformation of images and sounds into measurable and distributable commodities, and second, the transformation of individuals into specialized units of consumption capable of constantly absorbing new audiovisual commodities as objects of attention. The devices and technologies developed in Thomas Ava Edison's enterprise, the kinematograph, a forerunner of cinema, the gramophone, and the stock ticker in particular, sliced the sensory realm into abstracted and exchangeable bits of information that would circulate with ever greater speed and in ever greater numbers. This resulted in, to quote Crary, a dramatic reordering of visuality, implying the new importance of models based on an economy of forces rather than an optics of representation. Images, both popular and artistic, started to problematize subjectivity in terms of physiological and mental forces whose productivity would be systematized and maximized. In particular, this new visual economy gave rise to and distributed the sensibility of an observer suspended between attention and distraction, which is to say, an observer whose sensory apparatus and perceptual focus became the key force and source of value. It is less a question of ideologies than one of specific kinds of dispositifs, to utilize a concept that Michel Foucault developed in tandem with his genealogy of biopolitics. Giorgio Agamben highlights the etymological parallel between dispositif and oikonomia, especially in the sense of divine economy, which the word acquired in Christian theological conceptualizations of divine rule on earth, and which closely corresponds to the notion of visual economy Monzane has analyzed in Byzantine texts. Without going into the details of Agamben's analysis, dispositif and oikonomia both find their semantic core in the notion of government, which is to say in the sets of practices, measures, institutions, and bodies of knowledge used to organize and control the movements, behaviors, and actions of humans and other living beings. Today, there is not even a single instant in which the life of individuals is not modeled, contaminated, or controlled by some apparatus. According to Agamben, today we are witnessing the most docile and cowardly social body that has ever existed in human history, and the triumph of oikonomia, which Agamben describes as a pure activity of government that aims at nothing other than its own replication. As Foucault observed, neoliberalism makes economic rationality the model of social relations and of existence itself, a form of relationship of the individual to himself, time, those around him, the group, and the family. According to this model, the individual becomes molded into homo economicus, an entrepreneur of himself, being for himself his own capital, being for himself his own producer, being for himself the source of his earnings. Neoliberal political rationality sees human life in terms of human capital that needs to be maximized, and individuals as ability machines in constant competition with one another, machines that implement this imperative in their actions, beliefs, and thoughts. In neoliberal biopolitics, the subjects of government and social organization thus shift from being law-abiding men of rights to being dynamic multiplicities of autonomous, competitive, speculating, entrepreneurial, and consuming individuals who fundamentally lack political consciousness and an idea of a collective action. Neoliberalism's instrumentalization of human existence works to undermine the Enlightenment ideal of self-constituting, rational, and morally autonomous political subjects who come together to form social bonds through informed communication and mutual recognition. What becomes normative in the making of Homo economicus is the so-called freedom to optimize and maximize the accumulation of capital, both physical and human, through calculation, competition, and speculation. Neoliberal subjects are controlled through their freedom. They are fundamentally obliged to be free to govern and enhance themselves, go to the gym to conform to a physical norm of healthiness, consume video games for personal satisfaction, in a world full of possibilities, and consequently contingencies and risks. Exercising freedom means becoming atomized units of production and consumption and being constantly exposed to uncertainty and danger. Given that the biopolitical apparatus is, to quote Deleuze, a machine that is almost blind and mute even though it makes others see and speak, it is the neuroscientific way of seeing and speaking about the subject that best explains the logic according to which video games assume and position the persons who play them. Neuropower involves the production of people in the future, that is, the management of what individuals can become. A detail in Modern Warfare 3's interface exemplifies this type of curating of minds. Notably, what adds an extra cognitive and effective dimension to the first-person shooter video game is the two-dimensional minimap of where the battles take place, visible in the upper left corner of the screen. Typical of the aesthetics of most action-based video games, the map is live rather than static. It shows the movements and positions of teammates as green triangles and those of enemies as throbbing red dots, once a kill streak named Spy Drone is deployed. Like the minimap, brain maps are also dynamic, not static like those of classical cartography. Brain maps are mercurial, changing from moment to moment to reflect the changes that are happening in the neurons that feed them, which in turn reflect the changes in the interior of our body and in the world around us. The brain's work of mapping is not only embodied, temporal, and dynamic, but also selective and imaginative, discriminatory and categorizing. That is, it not only represents, but it also creates based on value. Value comes from the original set of dispositions that originate our life regulation and from the valuations that all images we have gradually acquired in our experience have been accorded. Value systems, relating most fundamentally to the biological need to maintain and regulate homeostasis, selectively cut and compose the mind's imagery, whether consciously or unconsciously experienced, working much like film editors. Value is a precondition for arriving at a perceptual or behavioral response. Regarding the onset of trauma, it's not so much the content of the external situation that matters, but rather the involuntary, self-generated imagery of fear and anxiety, which recapitulates the evolutionary past of the human animal. Contemporary neuroscience holds that the brain is a closed, self-referential, and self-activating system geared towards generating intrinsic images instead of faithfully representing the external world. The brain emulates reality instead of acting as a simple translator. The significance of sensory experience lies not in its informational content, but rather in how it corresponds to internal states that reflect ancestral circuits, acquired through evolution and the intrinsic images that these contain. The imagery of first-person shooter games thus reflects the general thanatographic nature of our biopolitical screens. Thanatographic referring to representations of violence provoking physiological changes, analogous to the provocation of physiological change through pornography. and hence to the modulation of behavioral patterns distributed across a population. In a sense, then, the reality of the wars soldiers now wage does not originate in the brain's orientation toward an interpretation of the external world, but rather in the regulation of basic action and effect programs by media technologies, and in the endogenous imagery they produce. At the heart of the immune system lies the experience of its own original alteration. Before any other transformation, each body is already exposed to the need for its own exposure. In this analysis, the immune system can define itself not by closing itself off, but only through its fundamental openness. Every image holds the seeds of this aberrant force of time.